Franklin Delano Roosevelt came from a branch of one of the oldest and wealthiest Dutch American families in the country. His wife, Eleanor, was the niece of former President Theodore Roosevelt. She came from the other branch of the family, and they were distant cousins. Roosevelt led a very privileged life. He grew up handsome and strong, became a public servant, working as Assistant Secretary of the Navy like his cousin Theodore had done. Then he became the Democratic nominee for vice president in 1920, even though the ticket lost to Warren G. Harding and the Republicans. FDR was considered to be the heir presumptive in 1924. However, an attack of the polio virus, for which at the time there was no vaccine yet, nearly killed him and rendered his legs useless. He would be bound to a wheelchair or have to carry 10 pounds of steel braces around his legs when he had to stand to speak. Despite what would have crippled many in their mind and spirit, FDR overcame his affliction. He was elected governor of New York for 2 consecutive terms starting in 1928, and then was nominated and elected President of the United States in 1932, promising Americans a New Deal. This New Deal created government services and agencies to help alleviate the suffering of the American people and provide an effective countermeasure to the Bolshevism and fascism that visited themselves on other nations. It fundamentally altered the role of the American government to the American people. While the actual effectiveness of the New Deal remains an item of debate to this day, as well as for a U.S. history class, Roosevelt shepherded the country through the Depression and was prepared to leave office in 1940, having served 2 consecutive terms like many presidents had done. However, the impending crises in both Europe and the Pacific led him to seek and win an unprecedented 3rd term and remain at the helm of the country as the winds and waves of war lapped at the American shores. In order to defeat Germany, the Allies put together what was known as the Grand Alliance. It was not an alliance founded on particularly friendly relations. The Soviets and the British, Stalin and Churchill, did not particularly like each other. It was more of an enemy of my enemy is my friend model. It was the Americans that tried to negotiate and keep the British and the Soviets basically on the same page. Roosevelt was very close to Churchill. They were actually distant cousins as well and got along very well. But where Churchill butted heads with Stalin, Roosevelt was putting an arm trying to cajole the man who he called Uncle Joe after a while, trying to keep Russia's feelings and temperament always at the forefront. The commanders of this alliance, again, a bunch of individuals with great egos, tremendous ambition. The Soviets were led by Georgy Zhukov. He's one of the few Russian commanders that could actually look Stalin in the face and tell him what he could go do with himself and get away with it. The British were eventually led by Field Marshal Bernard Law Montgomery, better known as Monty. Monty was a quintessential soldier's soldier. He was absolutely adored by his men. He shared in the privations of his men. He did not try to seem more important than his men. But inside the office, he was an incredibly big pain in the behind. He was a prima donna. He was a glory hound. He was an intriguer. He was devious. He was always trying to get the top command for himself, and he often fought or quarreled with many of the American commanders like George S. Patton and Omar Bradley, who could not stand him. But it's Dwight Eisenhower, who was the American commander, that is named Supreme Commander of all the Allied forces, which made Monty angry for a little while. But Eisenhower, despite the fact that he had not served in the First World War, was not known for being a strategist or a tactician, was incredibly well known for being a person who could get a wide variety of people to work together. And it is Eisenhower that will help the British and the Americans at least the British and American generals, from not fighting against each other by talking to the Soviets and keeping them basically on the same page, even though they're on the other side of the front. The strategy that the Allies adopt as this war begins for them is that Germany is the most existential threat. They must defeat Germany first. But while Stalin wanted the Allies to open up a second front in Europe, the Allies understood that American power and might needed to be built up in Europe over a period of time, and that the Germans were better whittled away on the edges, on the periphery, like North Africa, like in Italy, which Churchill called the soft underbelly of Europe, which is many things, Italy, but it's not soft. They would not open up a second front in Europe until 1944. When they were asked, though, at the conference in Casablanca, Morocco, what was the goal of the Allies toward the Axis powers, President Roosevelt answered unconditional surrender, which he had not conferred with the British or the French or any of the other allies about this. Many of the British and the French and the other allies wanted a negotiated settlement at first, but Roosevelt said that the Allies, the Axis, must put down their weapons without any negotiation whatsoever, which meant that the war might have gone on longer, but at the same time, there was no hope of the Nazi Party ever really rising again. And there is General Eisenhower, who would bring all sides together and give a lot of deference to the British over his American commanders from time to time, but at the same time keep his American commanders very close and in the loop. The main Allied commanders in Western Europe, on the far left is Bernard Law Montgomery, better known as Monte. In the center was the man who absolutely despised Monty, and Monty despised him. That is our old friend George S. Patton. Patton, as I already said, a World War I veteran, an aficionado of the tank. He was a strange bird, too. He believed in reincarnation. He believed that he was actually the reincarnated version of the Roman general Scipio Africanus, who defeated the Carthaginians back 260 years before Christ. On the right is the soldier's soldier, Omar Bradley, who was as mild-mannered and unassuming as Patton was loud and bombastic. Patton was known as Old Blood and Guts. Bradley, on the other hand, was the type of general that the men fought for him because they loved him. The men fought for Patton because they, A, either feared him, or B, he won. On the bottom row are many of the German commanders that you see. On the far left is Heinz Guderian. Guderian is actually the architect of the Blitzkrieg attacks in France and the Low Countries in 1940. You all, of course, remember our friend Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, who would fight Monty to stand still in North Africa until their defeat at El Alamein. Then you see the very prim proper Gerd von Rundstedt, second from the right. Von Rundstedt would be, along with Rommel, the two commanders that would try and hold off the Allied invasion of Normandy. And commanding down in Italy is Field Marshal Albert Kesselring. And I'll give you a guess as to what his nickname was, just by looking at the picture. Smiling Al. The various operations undertaken by the Allied and the Axis powers helped drive the Nazis and the fascists back into their home countries and force the end of the war. Once again, Hitler, now known to be living in something of an unreal and unhinged state and addicted to, shall we say, chemicals, continued with the insanity of not allowing his commanders to retreat, and, as if this were not bad enough, refusing to give his commanders authority to call upon tanks or what air support was left without his express permission. But such is the other side of the coin when being a dictator. The operations of this war in Europe were various and had different objectives. Operation Torch was the invasion of North Africa by the United States. This would eventually drive the Nazis out of North Africa and turn the former Vichy territories over to the Free French. Operations Husky and Avalanche in 1943 were the respective invasions of Sicily and Italy. But it was in Sicily that the British and Americans became involved in a race to the strategic city of Messina, and where Patton got himself in trouble for slapping soldiers afflicted with post-traumatic stress. He didn't believe in that, but it does exist. In Italy, the Allies found the going very rough, because Italy is a rather mountainous country. Although the Italians had overthrown and then imprisoned Mussolini, the Germans rescued Il Duce, who is now a shadow of his former self, and installed him as leader in northern Italy. Then they invaded Italy to keep the Italians in the war. Nonetheless, despite terrible battles at places like Cassino, where the ancient monastery of St. Benedict was destroyed, and Anzio, which was down on the beachhead near Rome, the city of Rome did fall on June the 4th, 1944. Interestingly enough, it was discovered at this time that the Roman Catholic Church's Holy Office in the Vatican, better known in the old days as the Inquisition, was actually helping Jews in hiding POWs, and they were led by an Irish Jesuit priest named Hugh O'Flaherty. Operation Overlord commenced 2 days after the fall of Rome, June the 6th, 1944. This was, of course, the great Allied sea and airborne invasion of Normandy. Part of the success for the Great Invasion was a phony army made up of inflatable tanks and planes and jeeps that all looked as if they were going to attack at the Pas de Calais when they instead were heading for Normandy. 2 weeks after the start of Overlord, the Soviet Red Army launched Operation Bagration in central Russia. This Soviet offensive destroyed 28 of 34 divisions of the German Army Group Center and completely shattered the German front lines. It was the biggest defeat in German military history and the 5th deadliest campaign in Europe. It killed around 450,000 soldiers, while another 300,000 soldiers were cut off in Latvia. It was now the Allies who were marching on. The liberation of Paris took place on August 25, 1944. It featured General Charles de Gaulle leading the Free French into the city down the Champs-Élysées, or as we say in New Orleans, Elysian Fields Avenue, and immediately went to the Cathedral of Notre Dame de Paris, and this brought an end to Vichy France. The Allies marched on, but now they were marching on faster than their supplies could keep up with them. In the rush for the Rhine River and a chance to end the war, the Allies were rushing forward like a spear, all the while leaving their major supply port in Normandy further and further behind. The other problem was that the Germans, while still losing the war, were not out of it. They were beginning to develop their rocket weapons, the V-1 and then later the V-2, which they felt could turn the tide of the war if they could just hold off the Allies. London, which had been pretty much kept out of attacks since the Blitz, now had a new blitz as V-1 and V-2 rockets began to fall. When the Allies captured the port of Antwerp in Belgium, but not its harbor, Monty came up with Operation Market Garden in September 1944. The object of this was to create a 64-mile salient, a bulge, into German territory with a bridgehead over the River Rhine, creating an Allied invasion route into northern Germany. This was to be achieved by seizing a series of 9 bridges with airborne forces, and then the land forces would swiftly follow over the bridges. The operation almost succeeded, but in this case almost does not count. It liberated the Dutch cities of Eindhoven and Nijmegen. Along with many towns, it created a 60-mile salient into German-held territory. It limited the V-2 rocket launching sites, but it did not secure the bridgehead over the Rhine at Arnhem, and the advance was halted at the river. There's a great movie about it called A Bridge Too Far, and it is directed by Sir Richard Attenborough. Richard Attenborough is the old man in the Jurassic Park movies. And so the Germans were now pushed back into Germany and starting to back up against the Rhine. But Hitler played his final and perhaps foolhardiest gamble with Operation Autumn Mist, in what became known as the Battle of the Bulge, the last German offensive of the war. Hitler and his generals planned to punch a hole in the Allied lines, much the same way they had done against the French and British in 1940. They would then wheel north toward the coast, bring in their new weapons, and force the Allies to negotiate a settlement in the west. Coming through the Ardennes, they would take advantage of poor weather, which meant the Allies could not bring their air superiority to bear. On December the 16th, 1944, during one of the coldest winters on record, the Germans took the Allies off guard and punched a 50-mile wide hole in the Allied lines, and only the incredible tenacity of units like the 101st Airborne, under siege in the city of Bastogne, slowed the Germans down. But that was enough. And when the weather cleared, the Allied air forces went to work. The Germans literally ran out of gas, and the entire offensive did nothing more than add some Allied POWs to the German lists and deprive the Wehrmacht of hundreds of irreplaceable tanks needed for defense against the final Soviet offensive on Berlin. After they had been stopped for a while and then pushed back, but the Allies now marched on. Now at last they came to the great moat that guarded the heart of Germany, the Rhine. The Germans had actually been trying to keep a few bridges open so it could allow its own soldiers to escape across it. And one of these was the bridge named after the old General Ludendorff from World War I. This was located at the town of Remagen. The Americans captured the bridge and kept it open despite German attempts to bomb it. It finally fell into the Rhine on St. Patrick's Day, 1945. While it stood, the bridge and the newly established pontoon bridges enabled the United States Army to make a bridgehead of 6 divisions, 125,000 troops, with tanks and artillery pieces and trucks. Capturing the bridge shortened the war, and then the Allies got into Germany and they discovered something to their delight. They discovered the Autobahns. The Autobahns actually helped the Allies move faster into Germany. From the time of the capture of the bridgehead in March of 1945, the German Reich would only last for another 2 months. By July of 1944, there were many within Germany that had grown sick of the Fuhrer, who had grown sick of the human extermination that was going on, and believed that Hitler was ruining Germany. One of them is the 36-year-old man in the picture right there, Klaus Philipp Maria Justinian Graf von Stauffenberg. He and other conspirators attempted to assassinate Hitler inside his Wolf's Lair field headquarters near Rostenburg, East Prussia, which is now in Poland. This took place on July the 20th, 1944. The name of the operation was called Valkyrie, which is the Old Norse Guardians of Heaven. And of course, Wagner wrote his great opera ride, part of the great opera Ride of the Valkyrie. This originally referred to only part of the conspiracy, but has become associated with the entire event, and it has provided, of course, the basis for a rather good movie starring Tom Cruise. And that's not always an easy thing to say. And one of the reasons why Tom Cruise did this movie is that he and von Stauffenberg actually looked very much alike. The plot involved assassinating Hitler, taking control of Germany and the army from the Nazi Party, including the SS, then make peace with the Western Allies as soon as possible, and then tell them, leave us alone to negotiate with the Russians separately, which was somewhat unreasonable in the minds of many of the Allies. The plot was the culmination of numerous efforts by several groups in the German resistance to overthrow the Nazis. Somehow or other, Hitler escaped death when one of his cronies actually moved the bomb that von Stauffenberg placed right by the Fuhrer and he moved it by accident to another part of the floor, behind the leg of the table that everybody was gathered around. The leg of the table shielded Hitler from most of the blasts. He was merely knocked unconscious and lost part of the use of his left arm that he never would get back throughout the rest of the war. He went on the radio later that day, Hitler did, and called for the conspirators to be arrested. The assassination plot failed. The intended military coup that was to follow led the Gestapo to arrest more than 7,000 people. They executed 4,980, of which von Stauffenberg and his close associates were all shot by firing squad. Some of the other conspirators were garroted by piano wire, means they're hung by piano wire. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the famous Desert Fox, was implicated in this assassination plot. We're not exactly sure what his role was. Hitler told him, you can go on trial, get a court-martial, be sentenced to death, and your family can lose everything, or you can go ahead and take a cyanide pill, commit suicide, and we'll give you a military burial with full honors. Rommel decided to kill himself. Here you see Martin Bormann, Hitler's personal secretary, Hermann Göring, his Reichsmarshal in charge of the Luftwaffe, and Bruno Lorzer surveying the damaged conference room after the blast that almost killed Hitler. It did kill people, but it didn't kill Hitler. Now, this map again of the European battlefield shows the back and forth of the German Wehrmacht as it moved toward Russia and then back across the Russian steppes as it retreated back on Berlin. You also see the North African desert. I had not mentioned the incredibly huge Battle of El Alamein, which is down at the bottom center right in Egypt. This was an incredibly huge battle that the British turned back the German tanks from there, and in this way they kept open the Suez Canal and they kept Egypt free.
In this map you see how the Allied forces are now pincing in on Germany. Coming from the east are the Soviets, and from the west the Allies led by the Americans and the British and the Free French.
The photograph in the upper left is of the Normandy beachhead at Omaha Beach. This is well after the invasion has taken place. They converted this into a huge port to bring in all sorts of supplies. On the lower right, you see the Ludendorff Bridge crossing the Rhine at the town of Remagen. There is also another very entertaining movie about the bridge at Remagen. It is titled The Bridge at Remagen. It is produced by David L. Wolper. He is the same producer that produced such wonderful movies as Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory.
In the upper left, you see the shores of Normandy, the beaches of Normandy, site of the greatest air and seaborne invasion in all human history. More than 150,000 men crossed the Channel from England to France and then began to drive toward Paris. In the lower right is the Ludendorff Bridge that crosses the Rhine River at Remagen in Germany. This was the first bridge that was captured by the Allies across the Rhine, despite the attempts of the Germans to blow it up. They used the wrong explosives, and so they didn't get it blown up. And this gave the Allies, the Americans especially, an avenue into Germany at last.
This map shows the farthest extent of the Allied forces in pink and then in red, and the forces of the Germans in white by the end of the war. And you can see that the Russians and the Allies in the West were marching toward each other.
Turning to the Pacific and East Asia, the Japanese began to crumble as American military might and wartime production outstripped their foe. In addition, the Japanese military government lied to the people at home by saying that the war was going well, but allowing their armies to wither on the vine both on the Pacific Islands and in Manchuria. Meanwhile, General Douglas MacArthur now led from Australia the campaign to retake the Philippines and move on Japan. The two-pronged campaign began on the jungle island of Guadalcanal in the Solomon Archipelago, where the U.S. Marines slogged it out between 1942 and 43. The campaign also began coming from the east, when the Marines waded ashore on Tarawa in the Gilbert Islands. In what became known as Bloody Tarawa, U.S. casualties were so high and Japanese resistance so fierce that the U.S. decided to adopt an island-hopping strategy, in which the Allies would bypass Japanese strongholds like that on the island of Rabaul and let them wither on the vine. Nonetheless, some strongholds would have to be captured, especially for their valuable airfields that would soon allow long-range bombers to attack the main Japanese islands. Crucial to this campaign were the islands of Guam, Saipan, and especially Tinian, with its long airstrip in the Marianas Islands. Down in the south, the American and Australian forces slogged it out against more than 150,000 Japanese troops in New Guinea. Eventually, MacArthur left from New Guinea and made good on his promise to return to the Philippines. In the first true urban fighting of the Pacific War, the U.S. forces recaptured Manila and fought house to house in the city before finally ending the Japanese occupation and freeing thousands of U.S. and Philippine POWs, as well as American citizens who had been confined to a small compound. As the vice tightened on Japan, the Allies now took the important island of Iwo Jima, which would allow the bombers to have fighter protection over Japan. Of course, Iwo Jima is well known for its famous flag raising, which actually occurred at the start of the battle rather than at its conclusion, and 3 of the 6 men in that famous photograph would be dead before the end of the battle. The Allies now had the upper hand and managed to go ashore on the island of Okinawa, which meant that they were only 350 miles from Tokyo. However, the battle came at a terrible price. General Simon Bolivar Buckner, whose father had served in the Civil War, was the highest-ranking soldier to be killed in the battle. The famous war correspondent Ernie Pyle was also killed at Okinawa. Marines and Army soldiers witnessed and endured civilians, often women and children, sacrificing themselves as IEDs rather than surrender, and this was an ominous indication of what would happen if and when the Allies invaded Japan. And there was something even worse. Going back in time to the 1300s, the Japanese were facing an impending invasion by a Mongol fleet. The people of Japan prayed fervently to their gods, the kami, to spare them from this ordeal. Suddenly, from out of nowhere, it seemed, a typhoon rose up and damaged the Mongol fleet and saved the Japanese. The thankful Japanese called this typhoon a divine wind, a gift from the gods, or a kamikaze in Japanese. Now, in 1945, kamikazes consisted of training a young man well enough to know where he knew how to take off with a plane that was filled with as much gasoline and explosives as it could carry, pumping the hapless pilot with enough rice wine to get him drunk enough where he did not mind what he was going to do next. What then happened was that the pilot aimed his plane for the nearest ship, hoping that he would not be shot down before he got to his target, and sacrificing himself for the emperor and taking as many Americans as possible. And this is what the planners of Operations Olympic and Coronet, the invasions of the southern islands of Japan, and then the main island of Honshu, would expect when they invaded. Estimates of casualties were in the range of 1 million men total, with all 6 Marine divisions, several Army divisions, and millions more civilian casualties. Considered totally unacceptable, especially given the coming confrontation that they saw coming with the Soviets. The Americans now relied upon a special project that had been undertaken since 1941 to create a weapon capable of ending the war in one stroke. Here you see the major points on the map as the U.S. went along the road to Tokyo, from Pearl Harbor to the Philippines to the Solomon Islands to New Guinea, and then Saipan and Tinian and Iwo Jima and Okinawa, and finally to the Japanese islands. Be familiar with these places. In this photo, one can see General MacArthur wading ashore on the island of Leyte in the Philippines. Directly behind him is Philippines President Manuel Quezon, after whom the capital city is now named. When Quezon quipped that he hoped the water was not too deep because he did not know how to swim, MacArthur replied that that was no big deal. Everyone can see that I can't walk on water. This photograph is typical of MacArthur, staging the scene for dramatic effect. The end of the Second World War resulted in a great victory, but an imperfect peace. That is, the end of the Nazi regime came about, putting to rest the greatest existential threat in human history. The Allies in the West, though, allowed the Soviets to capture Berlin, and they held much of Eastern Europe, including Poland. With the Red Army just yards away from his bunker, Adolf Hitler committed suicide on April the 30th, 1945, having just married his longtime mistress Eva Braun the day before. Hitler's cronies then burned both his and Braun's bodies to keep them from falling into Russian hands. The next day, Nazi propagandist Joseph Goebbels and his wife committed suicide, taking with them their 6 female children in the process via poison. The U.S. Army decided against capturing Berlin and captured the Ruhr in the southwest instead because of its economic and industrial potential. Admiral Karl Dönitz assumed leadership of the husk of the Nazi state and then ordered all commanders to give in to the Allied demand for unconditional surrender, which German General Wilhelm Keitel did in Reims, France, and other German armies did in Latvia and Czechoslovakia on May the 8th, 1945, which was called Victory in Europe, or VE Day. People came out into the streets of America, Times Square in New York, Canal Street in New Orleans, Grant Park in Chicago, and so on. But the war in the Pacific still had 3 months to go. The end of Japan would not happen until August. When the successful Manhattan Project exploded the first atomic bomb in New Mexico and then sent another bomb under heavy secrecy to the island of Tinian with its long airfield. It was nicknamed Little Boy. The first atomic bomb dropped on the city of Hiroshima on August 6, 1945, killing more than 100,000 people and dooming several thousand more to radiation sickness and cancer. As the Japanese were considering surrender, another bomb, nicknamed Fat Man, fell on Nagasaki on August 9, 1945, killing another 60,000. There is some debate about whether that bomb was even necessary. The military tried to keep the emperor from surrendering at the last moment, but Hirohito managed to secret out a taped message calling on the Japanese to surrender. On what was called VJ Day, Victory in Japan Day, August 14, 1945, the Japanese people wept as they heard their soft-spoken emperor speak to them for the first time ever. The Japanese delegation then signed the Articles of Unconditional Surrender on September 2, 1945, on the deck of the battleship USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay, in another one of the great MacArthur pageants. Off to the side and against the bulkhead of the ship was the same American flag that Commodore Matthew Perry had aboard his ship when he first went steaming into Tokyo Bay 82 years earlier. Here, one can see the devastation caused by the atomic bomb in Hiroshima. The atomic bomb changed warfare forever. In the photograph of the upper left, the Japanese delegation from the government and the military stand ready to sign the documents of surrender. The emperor was not with them. MacArthur protected the emperor, which angered some later historians who felt that he should have been prosecuted as a war criminal. In the photograph in the lower right, Admiral Chester Nimitz signs his name to the documents of surrender on behalf of the U.S. Navy. Standing behind him are MacArthur, Admiral William Bull Halsey, and General Jonathan Wainwright, who had been the one to surrender on the Philippines 3 years earlier. With the military aspect of the war concluded, the Allied powers now sought to punish the Nazis and the Japanese militarists for pursuing what they considered was an unlawful war under international law. The problem was that international law really had not been used just yet. The Kellogg-Briand Pact had kind of established it, but it was not really something that everybody accepted. Now, the cost of the war was approximately $1.5 trillion. The total death toll was upwards of 50 million, which is a conservative estimate. The entire population of Central Europe had become semi-nomadic as people fled before the invading armies and sought shelter from the bombing of the cities. Europe, for so long considered by several the center of civilization, was now reduced to a second-tier power status as the United States and the Soviets now assumed leadership in world affairs, and China was not far behind. The first use of international law came with the Nuremberg war trials held in the center of the Nazi Empire, the city of Nuremberg, where Hitler staged his grandest rallies. Between 1945, November of 1945, and October of 1946, Supreme Court Justice Robert Jackson, former Attorney General Francis Biddle, and a number of British, French, and Soviet judges prosecuted the former Nazis and German lackeys of the regime. Many Nazis and Germans, including Hermann Göring, Alfred Jodl, Wilhelm Keitel, and Rudolf Hess, were sentenced either to death or life imprisonment, while other Nazis like Albert Speer, who used Jewish labor to build Hitler's grand buildings, was given 20 years, and then was released, and then wrote a tell-all book called Inside the Third Reich. To prosecute the Japanese war leaders, the International Tribunal for the Far East had a number of British, American, Australian, Dutch, and Indian judges. In the end, Hideki Tojo, the Japanese Prime Minister, and Masaharu Homma, the conqueror of the Philippines, and Tomiko Yamashita, the conqueror of Malaya, were convicted and executed, with a number of other Japanese leaders either executed or sentenced to life. One particular grisly case involved the commanders on the island of Chichijima, who executed and then cannibalized the livers of several American pilots who were shot down and captured over or near the island. One of the flyboys, who was saved, almost miraculously by his own men after being shot down, was a young Navy pilot by the name of George Herbert Walker Bush, the future President of the United States. As the Allies met to determine the post-war order, they resolved to avoid a repeat of the mistakes at Versailles. After serious discussion, Germany would be left intact, but it would be divided into 4 zones of occupation, with the Soviets, Americans, British, and French each controlling a sector, and the city of Berlin, which was well inside the Soviet sector, would also be divided. The country would also undergo denazification, that is, no one above a certain rank in the Wehrmacht or major Nazi officials would be allowed to hold office either for a number of years or forever. Germany would then make reparations, but they would not be as draconian as Versailles dictated, although the Soviets had been essentially cannibalizing German industry and taking it into Russia to repair all that had been damaged during the invasion of Russia. The post-war order also remade the map of Europe. Poland had its borders shifted west, as the Soviets sought to increase their security against a future German attack and also enact more reprisals on the Polish people, whom they regarded still as an enemy. Austria, which had been annexed to Germany in 1938, was once again detached from Germany and made a neutral nation. In the Pacific, Japan was reduced to its original size and status, and MacArthur was named military governor of Japan. Despite some criticisms, the emperor and the government structure remained. All conquered territories would be returned, and the Japanese army was removed from China and Southeast Asia. Although the emperor remained, he did have to renounce his divine status in what later was called the Declaration of Humanity of 1946. MacArthur then remade Japan in a very progressive image. He had them write a new constitution which renounced war, had a Bill of Rights, enacted labor codes, and even advocated for the liberation of women. The Americans and the Japanese signed a treaty of peace in San Francisco in 1951. This was complete peace between Japan and the United States and started the Japanese on the road to becoming the U.S.'s closest ally and friend. The picture in the upper left shows the dock in Nuremberg with the Nazi collaborators on trial. You see several of them wearing glasses because they had become so hooked on drugs that bright light affected them. In the upper right is probably the most tragic figure of the whole trial, Rudolf Hess, who was a devout Nazi, a devout anti-Semite. There's no defense of him there. But he had not really done anything, and he was mentally ill. He parachuted into Scotland in a very strange attempt to try and broker peace between Hitler and England. Hitler then disavowed him. Speer was put in the Tower of London and then put on trial. He was sentenced to life in prison in Spandau Prison, where he basically goose-stepped until he was around the age of 95 and then hung himself with electrical cord. In the lower right is a very thin Hermann Goering. At the end of the war, he was captured. He weighed over 300 pounds. He was heavily addicted to drugs. They put him in prison, put him on a diet, got him off of the drugs.
This photograph
he cleared up considerably and proved to be a very formidable witness
even more than his
against the American prosecution. MacArthur,
despite being
right,
ordered by the emperor's advisors not
Albert
to touch
Speer,
or take a photo with
Hitler's
Hirohito,
architect.
immediately
and
strode up to the emperor,
gave him a hearty
handshake,
handshake, and then took this photo with the diminutive Hirohito. For his part, the emperor did not object and proved to be a very willing help to the Americans throughout their occupation and then afterwards. Hirohito died in 1989. Several of the people that went to his funeral would not do the full formal bow because they believed that he was still responsible for what Japan had done to their nations in World War II. Here you see the remade map of Europe post-World War II with the areas that are considered Western leaning and neutral leaning and those that are under the yoke of the Communist Party. Eventually Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and Romania will fall to within the Soviet orbit, as will Bulgaria. Yugoslavia will become part of the Communist orbit, but not part of the Soviet orbit, because no Soviet troops had ever occupied Yugoslavia. The map of Asia, you see here, with the coming struggle for China and Southeast Asia apparent. The area in gold or yellow is run by the Kuomintang, that is the Chinese nationalists, while the more maroon area is run by Mao Zedong and the Chinese People's Army. Eventually, in 1949, Mao will win all of China from the nationalists. So in China, there was the Second World War against the Japanese, but there was also a civil war going on at the exact same time. And the Middle East got a makeover as well, as several of the areas in the region of Palestine, Lebanon, and the Sinai are carved out. Syria and Lebanon and Iraq, which had been established by League of Nations mandates, now were made United Nations mandates. And of course, the region of Palestine would now become a contested region as many Jews who escaped from Europe and the Holocaust now moved there to create their own country, the nation of Israel. And this would cause lasting problems in the Middle East, as we're well aware of today.